Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating subject drawn straight from the Manifesto of Progressive Revelation. We're going to tackle the intense friction so many of us feel when historical doctrines change, and we'll explore exactly how pure abstract truth interacts with our very limited mortal vessels. If you've ever felt a pang of cognitive dissonance watching spiritual teachings evolve over time, well, you definitely aren't alone. This explainer breaks down a highly structured framework for understanding exactly why that happens, and more importantly, why it's actually by design.
Okay, let's just dive right into this by confronting a pretty jarring question, one that immediately strikes at the heart of our basic assumptions about how divine communication even works. If a prophet, a leader, or an institution is corrected later on, does that mean the original revelation was just a total fraud? Our modern minds tend to demand instant perfection. We expect our software updates to be completely bug-free on day one. But as the source material reveals, applying that expectation to spiritual truth completely misinterprets the actual mechanics of how revelation is received. Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how it exposes what's called the false binary trap. It's basically a mental corner that forces believers into two absolute unyielding extremes. Either you fiercely defend every single historical statement as eternally perfect, or you completely reject the entire system the very moment a flaw is found. But the reality of truth is far more precise and honestly far more dynamic than either of those extremes. Assuming it has to be all or nothing, that is exactly where so many truth seekers get completely stuck. So, the crucial point here is captured beautifully in this quote. Revelation may be perfect in origin without being complete in mortal comprehension. Think about what happens when pure light hits an imperfect, maybe slightly smudged prism. Perfect truth enters a mind that is heavily shaped by mortality. It's filtered through culture, vocabulary, hidden assumptions, and just everyday human limits. This means the light can be perfectly pure at its source, while its human reception, its expression, and its application remain deeply incomplete. We actually see this pattern of progressive architecture literally everywhere in the physical universe. The organizing force of the cosmos totally could have designed the universe according to a law of instantaneous completion, right? But everywhere we look, we observe progression. Seeds become trees over decades. Stars form through eons of ordered, refining processes. Spiritual understanding operates the exact same way. It isn't some sort of defect in communication, it is actually a profound mercy toward the receiver, who simply needs the time to build the capacity to understand. All of these universal patterns build into what the text defines as the resonance model. Rather than an instant magical download of facts, revelation is an ordered, seven-part process through which divine impressions take form and become increasingly coherent in human understanding. It combines with what we already know, compounds to enlarge our understanding, and then cycles through comparison, correction, and confirmation. Finally, it's consecrated for use only to continue expanding later. Let's look a bit closer at two of the most critical steps in this entire model.
First up is the strict requirement to compare. We absolutely have to remember that a claim that refuses comparison actually refuses refinement. True understanding must always be rigorously tested. It's kind of like a rigorous spiritual peer review process. It has to be weighed against established truths, moral coherence, and observable real-world consequences. If a new idea cannot be compared against the established, abstract character of divine truth, it simply cannot move forward in the process of becoming usable light.
Next is the crucial step of correction. Often, people view correction as a glaring sign of failure. Actually, scratch that. They usually see it as proof the whole thing was a lie to begin with. But here, correction is not the enemy of revelation. Rather, it's one of the core laws by which revelation actually becomes usable. And why is that? Because progression without correction just compounds distortion over time. Any cultural inheritance, exaggerated assumptions, or weak language attached to the original impression must be actively, intentionally pruned away so the core truth can actually thrive.
When we fail to recognize this critical need for progressive refinement, we stumble right into some really dangerous intellectual pitfalls. The source identifies these as the traps of mortal absolutism. Basically, these traps cause us to entirely misunderstand the mortal process of revelation. Let's examine how demanding instant perfection actually sets us up for failure, starting with a trap that catches almost everyone at some point.
The first one is the infallibility trap. This trap places a completely impossible burden on prophets and leaders that was never historically intended. It assumes that divine appointment acts like some sort of magic eraser for human limitation. But authority doesn't just eliminate personality, bias, agency, or cultural assumptions. A person can possess genuine, life-changing inspiration while still desperately needing further light, growth, and, yes, correction. Then we have the first draft trap. Anyone who has ever looked back at an email they wrote in a hurry knows for sure that a first draft is rarely perfect. The source reminds us that when a spiritual idea is first expressed, the human receiver is wrestling with clunky language to capture an immense reality. That first verbal container is almost always inadequate. It should be preserved and studied, absolutely, but we shouldn't worship it as if its initial vocabulary is completely immune from future refinement.
And, just as individuals struggle with first drafts, entire organizations fall hard into the institutional pride trap. This happens when groups fear that admitting a need for correction will automatically weaken their authority. They end up protecting earlier, incomplete declarations to prioritize their reputation over actual truth. But in reality, when an institution admits incompleteness and honestly corrects itself, it doesn't show weakness at all. It proves that its revelatory current is still actively moving, rather than being stagnant and dead.
Another massive hurdle here is the familiarity trap. It is just so easy to mistake a cozy, repetitive tradition for absolute truth. When a new, refining truth comes along, it creates cognitive dissonance, and we often panic, assuming the new idea is dangerous simply because it feels uncomfortable. But listen, dissonance isn't automatic evidence of falsehood. Sometimes it simply reveals that a lesser, more limited framework in our minds is being directly challenged by a much greater, expansive truth.
So how do we escape all these traps? The answer really lies in maintaining a truly living tradition. If leaders are penalized by their followers for clarifying or correcting previous teachings, revelation just becomes a prisoner of history. This effectively makes the past far more authoritative than the living flow of truth today. A living system must continuously and fearlessly cycle through receiving, expressing, comparing, correcting, and continuing. Now, of course, the resonance model doesn't permit endless chaotic doctrinal mutation without a center. It relies strictly on an ultimate standard. Every claimed revelation must be measured against the abstract, divine pattern of perfect truth, love, agency, and reconciliation. This abstract pattern, rather than specific historical phrasing, is the governing metric. It's the ultimate yardstick against which all lesser, mortal expressions of truth must be continually tested and aligned. To figure out if a claimed revelation actually aligns with this standard, the source provides 3 rigorous, grounding questions about the fruits the teaching produces. First, agency. Does the teaching increase light and personal responsibility? Second, growth. Does it invite genuine development, or does it secretly rely on fear, manipulation, and enforced ignorance? And finally, truth. Does it actually withstand honest, thorough examination? If a teaching fails these basic tests, it requires correction.
As seekers of truth, we basically have to intentionally navigate a very precise middle path. We have to steer straight between demanding artificial perfection on one side, which is blind absolutism, and tumbling into cynical rejection on the other. Progressive revelation means accepting that we're on a continuous journey. We utilize the consecrated truth we have for today while deliberately staying wide open to the greater, more refined light of tomorrow.
Making all of this work ultimately comes down to one massive ingredient: profound humility from absolutely everyone involved. The revealer must remain humble enough to separate their own cultural assumptions from pure inspiration. And the hearer? They must be humble enough to accept the mortal limitations of the messenger without losing faith in the message itself. Both parties must remain completely accountable to the truth, avoiding that pride of finality that stubbornly says we have absolutely nothing left to learn.
I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to really chew on as we wrap up. Are the heavens closed because our understanding changes? Or does our understanding change because the heavens remain open? Remember, honest refinement does not weaken revelation. It is the very proof that the source of truth is still actively speaking. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep refining your understanding.